Welcome to Green Horizons, where we explore the most fascinating transformations in environmental policy. I'm Alex, joined as always by my curious co-host, Rowan.
Hey everyone! Alex, I've got to say, today's topic has me really intrigued. When you first mentioned Baden-Württemberg, I immediately thought of Mercedes-Benz and Porsche, but there's a lot more to this story, isn't there?
Oh, you're in for a treat, Rowan. We're diving into how this German state, known worldwide for its luxury cars, has become an unexpected environmental pioneer. It's actually quite remarkable, they've managed to keep their industrial powerhouse status while becoming one of Europe's leading climate champions.
Wait, so they're successfully balancing both? That sounds like quite a challenge.
Exactly. And what makes this story so compelling is how they're doing it. We'll look at their groundbreaking climate laws, particularly their 2013 Climate Protection Act, which really set things in motion. They're aiming for climate neutrality by 2040, which is pretty ambitious for a region so deeply rooted in traditional industry.
I'm particularly interested in how the auto industry is handling this transition. I mean, we're talking about the home of some of the world's most prestigious car manufacturers.
And that's definitely one of the most fascinating parts of this story. We'll explore how these companies are adapting, the tensions that have emerged, and some surprisingly positive outcomes that nobody really expected. Let me take you back to 2013 because that's when Baden-Württemberg really changed the game. Their Climate Protection Act wasn't just another piece of legislation. It was the first time a German state had created binding climate targets through law.
So what made this law so special? I mean, we hear about climate laws all the time now.
Well, the timing is crucial here. 2013 was still relatively early in terms of regional climate action. Most places were still talking about making changes, but Baden-Württemberg actually put it into law. They committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2020, compared to 1990 levels.
That's actually pretty bold for 2013. Were people skeptical about it?
Oh, absolutely. There was significant pushback, especially from the industrial sector. You have to remember, this is a region where manufacturing accounts for a huge part of the economy. But what's fascinating is how they approached the negotiations.
I'm guessing they had to do some serious convincing?
They did. And here's where it gets interesting. Instead of just imposing regulations, they created what they called a Climate Protection Council. This brought together industry leaders, environmental experts, and government officials to shape the implementation.
That sounds smart, getting everyone on board from the start.
Exactly. And they did something else that was quite innovative. The law required regular monitoring and reporting. They essentially built in accountability from day one.
But wait, how did they actually enforce this? I mean, laws are great, but implementation is where things often fall apart.
That's a great question. The law established something called the Integrated Energy and Climate Protection Concept. It laid out specific sectoral targets and measures. Everything from building regulations to transport policies had to align with these climate goals.
And did it work? I mean, did they actually hit their targets?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. While they didn't quite hit their 2020 target, they got close enough that it proved the concept was viable. They achieved about 22% reduction instead of 25%.
That's still pretty impressive considering how industrial the region is.
And here's what I find most fascinating. The law actually sparked a wave of innovation. Research institutions like the Zentrum für Sonnenenergie and Wasserstoffforschung started getting more support and attention.
Could you translate that for those of us who don't speak German?
Sorry, it's the Center for Solar Energy and Hydrogen Research. They became crucial in providing scientific backing for the state's climate policies.
So this law wasn't just about restrictions, it was actually driving innovation?
Precisely. And it created this interesting domino effect. Other German states started looking at Baden-Württemberg's model. By 2015, several other regions were developing their own climate protection laws.
You know what surprises me? The fact that a region known for luxury cars and heavy industry was the one leading this charge. It's kind of counterintuitive.
That's what makes this story so compelling. They prove that being environmentally progressive doesn't mean sacrificing economic strength. In fact, many companies started seeing climate protection as an opportunity rather than a burden.
I guess that's the real lesson here. Environmental protection and economic success aren't mutually exclusive.
Exactly. And this 2013 law laid the groundwork for even more ambitious targets later on. It showed that with the right framework and approach, significant change is possible, even in places where you might least expect it. You know what's fascinating about Baden-Württemberg's climate journey, Rowan? Behind all those ambitious policies, there's this incredible network of research institutions making it all possible.
I'm guessing these aren't just your average research labs?
Not at all. The state has really positioned itself as a research powerhouse. The Fraunhofer ISI, for instance, has been instrumental in providing the scientific backing for many of their climate policies.
What exactly do these research centers focus on? I mean, climate science is pretty broad.
That's what's really interesting. They've developed this specialized ecosystem where different institutions focus on specific aspects. The Zentrum für Sonnenenergie und Wasserstoffforschung, or ZSW as it's commonly known, specializes in renewable energy and hydrogen technology.
Hydrogen seems to be popping up everywhere these days.
And for good reason. These research centers aren't just doing theoretical work. They're actively developing practical solutions. One of their goals is to have 25% of final energy consumption come from renewables.
25%, that's actually quite ambitious for an industrial region. How do they determine if these targets are even feasible?
This is where the scientific backbone really shows its worth. Before setting any major policy targets, they conduct extensive feasibility studies. The research institutions analyze everything from economic impacts to technical challenges.
So they're not just throwing numbers out there and hoping for the best?
Not at all. And here's something particularly interesting. These research centers have created this unique bridge between industry and policy. They help translate scientific findings into practical policy recommendations.
I imagine that's pretty crucial when you're dealing with major industrial players like Mercedes and Porsche.
Exactly. And what's really clever is how they've structured their research funding. The state ensures these institutions have consistent support, which allows them to focus on long-term projects rather than just quick wins.
But how do they make sure the research actually leads to real-world changes?
That's where their collaborative approach comes in. They've created these research clusters where scientists work directly with industry partners. It's not just theoretical research. It's about finding practical solutions that can be implemented.
Sounds like they've really thought this through, but surely there must be some challenges?
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest challenges is balancing pure research with practical applications. These institutions need to maintain their scientific integrity while also producing results that can be implemented in the real world.
I can see how that could create some tension.
And here's another interesting aspect. These research centers don't just focus on technology. They also study the social and economic impacts of climate policies. It's this holistic approach that makes their work so valuable.
That makes sense. I mean, the best technology in the world won't help if people don't accept it or can't afford it.
Precisely. And they've actually made some surprising discoveries. Their research has shown that aggressive environmental policies don't necessarily harm economic growth, something many people assumed would be the case.
That must help when they're trying to convince skeptics.
Absolutely. And what's particularly impressive is how they've managed to maintain this scientific momentum. Even during economic downturns, they've kept their research funding relatively stable.
It sounds like they're playing the long game here.
They really are. And you know what's particularly interesting? These research institutions have become sort of diplomatic bridges too. They're collaborating with similar centers across Europe, sharing knowledge and best practices.
So Baden-Württemberg's influence goes beyond just their own region?
Exactly. They've become this model for how to build a scientific foundation for climate policy. Other regions are now looking at their research infrastructure and trying to replicate it.
It's amazing how what started as local research centers have become such important players in the broader climate conversation.
And that's really the key takeaway here. Successful climate policy isn't just about setting targets. It's about having the scientific backbone to make those targets achievable and credible. You know, Rowan, there's another fascinating layer to this story that really challenges conventional wisdom. Baden-Württemberg has actually managed to grow its economy while pursuing these aggressive environmental policies.
Wait, so they're not just maintaining their economy, they're actually growing it? That seems counterintuitive.
I know, it's quite remarkable. The state has managed to position itself as what they call a green economy pioneer while staying one of Germany's wealthiest regions. They've essentially turned their environmental commitments into a competitive advantage.
How exactly does that work? I mean, these kinds of transitions usually come with pretty hefty costs.
Well, here's what's interesting. They've been incredibly strategic about it. Instead of seeing environmental regulations as a burden, they've used them as a catalyst for innovation. Companies are developing new technologies and processes that are actually opening up entirely new market opportunities.
So they're basically creating new business sectors?
Exactly. Take their automotive sector, for example. Instead of resisting the shift to electric vehicles, companies like Mercedes-Benz have embraced it. They're not just adapting their existing products, they're developing entirely new technologies and creating new jobs in the process.
But surely some traditional industries must be struggling with this transition?
That's what's so fascinating, Rowan. While there have definitely been challenges, many traditional industries have found ways to adapt and even thrive. They've developed what they call a green transformation strategy, helping traditional manufacturers pivot towards sustainable products and processes.
Can you give us some specific examples?
Sure, one really interesting case is in the manufacturing sector. Many companies have invested in energy-efficient production methods, which initially seemed expensive, but actually led to significant cost savings in the long run. They're seeing reduced energy bills, lower material costs, and even improved product quality.
That's surprising. So these environmental investments are actually paying off financially?
In many cases, yes. And here's another interesting aspect. The state has become a magnet for green technology investment. They've attracted companies and researchers who want to be part of this transformation, creating this virtuous cycle of innovation and economic growth.
But what about employment? I mean, that's usually a big concern with these kinds of transitions.
That's one of the most surprising outcomes. The green sector is actually creating more jobs than are being lost in traditional industries. They're seeing growth in areas like renewable energy installation, sustainable building renovation, and clean technology development.
I'm guessing these are different types of jobs, though?
You're absolutely right. And that's where their education and training programs come in. They've invested heavily in reskilling programs to help workers transition into these new roles. It's not just about creating jobs, it's about ensuring people can actually fill them.
So they're basically future-proofing their workforce?
Precisely. And it's creating this interesting ripple effect. As workers gain new skills, they're able to innovate in their new roles, which leads to even more opportunities. It's becoming this self-sustaining cycle of growth and innovation.
That's pretty impressive. But I have to ask, are there any downsides to this approach?
Well, it hasn't all been smooth sailing. Some smaller companies have struggled with the initial investment costs, and there have been some sectors that have found the transition more challenging than others. But what's interesting is how they've addressed these challenges. They've developed support mechanisms, financial incentives, technical assistance programs, and targeted funding for innovation. It's this comprehensive approach that's helping to ease the transition.
It sounds like they've really thought through the economic implications of all this.
They have, and perhaps most importantly, they've shown that environmental protection and economic growth aren't mutually exclusive. It's not about choosing between the environment and the economy. It's about finding ways to advance both together. Speaking of balancing growth and sustainability, there's a fascinating story unfolding in Baden-Württemberg's automotive sector that really shows how complex this transition can be.
I've been wondering about that. I mean, we're talking about the birthplace of the automobile, right?
Exactly. And that's what makes this transformation so remarkable. These companies aren't just making minor adjustments. They're completely reimagining what mobility looks like.
But how are they managing such a dramatic shift? I mean, these are companies that have been building traditional cars for over 100 years.
That's the fascinating part. They've developed this dual strategy. While they're still producing conventional vehicles, they're simultaneously investing enormous resources into electric and hydrogen technology development.
Sounds like they're hedging their bets.
It's more strategic than that. They're actually using their expertise in precision engineering and quality manufacturing to gain an advantage in the electric vehicle market. But here's what's really interesting. They're not just focusing on the vehicles themselves.
What do you mean?
Well, they've recognized that the future of automotive isn't just about the cars. It's about the entire mobility ecosystem. They're investing in charging infrastructure, battery technology, and even autonomous driving systems.
That must require a completely different set of skills, though. What happens to all the workers who've spent their careers working on traditional engines?
Now, that's where things get really interesting. The companies have created these extensive retraining programs. They're literally transforming their workforce from mechanical specialists into high-tech professionals.
I can't imagine that's an easy transition for everyone.
You're right, and here's something surprising. Many of the older workers have actually become some of the most enthusiastic advocates for the new technology. Their deep understanding of automotive engineering helps them spot opportunities for innovation that others might miss.
Really? That's not what I would have expected.
I know. And there's another fascinating aspect to this. The transformation isn't just happening at the big companies. The entire supply chain is evolving. Small and medium-sized suppliers are having to reinvent themselves too.
That sounds incredibly challenging for smaller companies with limited resources.
It is, but this is where Baden-Württemberg's support system comes in. They've created these innovation clusters where smaller companies can collaborate with research institutions and larger manufacturers. They're sharing resources, knowledge, and sometimes even facilities.
So it's kind of like a whole ecosystem adapting together?
Exactly. And you know what's particularly clever? They're using their traditional strengths, precision engineering, quality control, innovation, to create competitive advantages in the new automotive landscape.
But surely there must be some resistance to all this change.
Oh, absolutely. There have been intense debates about the pace of transition. Some argue it's too fast. Others say it's not fast enough. But what's interesting is how they're managing these conflicts.
How are they doing that?
They've created these dialogue forums where different stakeholders can voice their concerns and contribute to solutions. It's not just top-down decision-making, it's a collaborative process.
That sounds great in theory, but does it actually work in practice?
Well, here's a concrete example. When one major manufacturer announced plans to convert a traditional engine plant to electric vehicle production, they worked with unions and local government to create a transition plan that would protect jobs while meeting environmental goals.
And the workers were okay with this?
It wasn't without challenges, but they made it work by ensuring everyone had a voice in the process. They even created this interesting mentorship program where experienced workers partner with new technicians, sharing their knowledge while learning new skills themselves.
It sounds like they're really trying to bring everyone along on this journey.
That's exactly it. And perhaps the most important lesson from all this is that successful industrial transformation needs to be inclusive. It's not just about changing technology, it's about bringing people along with you. You know, Rowan, while we've talked about the successes, there's another fascinating side to Baden-Württemberg's story, the intense debates about whether they're moving too fast or not fast enough with their climate policies.
I can imagine that's creating some real tension. Are we talking about street protests, policy battles?
Both, actually. There's this really interesting divide that's emerged. Environmental groups are saying the 2040 climate neutrality target isn't ambitious enough, while some industry groups argue the pace is already too aggressive.
Sounds like a classic case of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. And what's particularly fascinating is how these debates play out in different parts of society. You've got local communities worried about wind turbine installations, industry leaders concerned about competitiveness, and environmental activists pushing for faster action.
But how do they actually handle these conflicts? I mean, you can't please everyone.
That's where it gets interesting. They've developed this unique approach to managing disagreements. Instead of trying to push through policies, they're creating what they call dialogue forums, places where different groups can voice their concerns and actually influence policy.
Does that actually work, though? I mean, these are pretty fundamental disagreements we're talking about.
Well, here's a surprising example. When they were planning a major solar installation near Stuttgart, local farmers initially strongly opposed it. But through these dialogue sessions, they actually developed a dual-use concept where the land could be used for both solar panels and agriculture.
Oh, wow. So they found a way to make it work for everyone?
Not always, but more often than you might think. Though I have to say some of the most heated debates are happening around transportation policies.
Let me guess, car-free zones in cities?
You got it. There was this huge controversy when Stuttgart proposed expanding its low-emission zone. Business owners were worried about losing customers, while environmental groups argued it wasn't extensive enough.
So how did they resolve that one?
They actually came up with this phased implementation approach. They started with smaller zones and gradually expanded them, while simultaneously improving public transport options. But here's what's really interesting. They used the controversy itself as a way to engage people in the broader climate discussion.
What do you mean?
Well, these debates have actually helped raise awareness about climate issues. People who might never have engaged with environmental policy before are now actively participating in these discussions.
That's actually pretty clever, turning conflict into engagement.
Exactly. Though I should mention, not all the resistance is about the speed of change. Some of it is about the distribution of costs and benefits. There's this ongoing debate about who should bear the financial burden of the transition.
I imagine that's a pretty sensitive issue.
It really is, and here's something fascinating. They're starting to experiment with what they call social climate funds, specifically designed to help lower-income households manage the transition costs.
But surely there must be some issues they just can't resolve through dialogue.
Oh, absolutely. The debates around industrial emissions targets have been particularly intense. Some companies have actually threatened to relocate if the targets aren't adjusted.
That sounds like a real challenge to their whole approach.
It is, but what's remarkable is how they're responding. Instead of backing down, they are actually using these challenges to drive innovation. They're creating new support programs, technical assistance, and even helping companies find ways to turn environmental requirements into competitive advantages.
So they're basically trying to turn opposition into opportunity?
That's exactly it. And while it doesn't always work, it's creating this interesting dynamic where even the resistance is somehow contributing to the overall transformation. You know, Rowan, what really stands out about Baden-Württemberg's story is how they've managed to reshape our understanding of what's possible in climate action.
I have to say, I'm genuinely surprised. When we started this conversation, I thought we'd be talking about compromise and trade-offs, but it's actually a story of innovation and opportunity, isn't it?
Exactly. And what's particularly fascinating is how they've shown that being an industrial powerhouse and a climate leader aren't mutually exclusive. They've created this blueprint that other regions can learn from.
Though I imagine not everyone can just copy and paste their approach.
No, and that's actually an important point. What they've demonstrated is more about the principles, the importance of scientific backing, inclusive dialogue, and long-term thinking. It's about finding your own path while learning from their experience.
I'm struck by how they've managed to bring so many different groups along on this journey. Researchers, industry, workers, communities.
And that might be their most valuable lesson. Real transformation isn't just about hitting targets or implementing policies. It's about creating a shared vision that people can believe in and contribute to.
So what's next for them?
Well, they're facing some big challenges ahead, particularly around their 2040 climate neutrality goal. But what's remarkable is how they've built this incredible foundation for facing those challenges. They've shown that with the right approach, ambitious climate action and economic success can go hand in hand.
Sounds like they're writing the playbook for industrial regions everywhere.
They really are. And that might be their most important contribution, showing that change is possible, even in the places where it seems most difficult.
Thanks for listening. If you liked, don't forget to share it with your friends. See you next time.